I wanted to start by sharing a little story, and let's pretend we are in an African village. So travel with me to an African village, and it's story time, it's evening time, it's story time. So two cultural experts walk into a room, and they're going in for dinner. During this dinner, the food is laid out with both European utensils and just the regular food. The researchers look at it. One of them said, this looks like something that is familiar to my culture. I'm going to make the meal the way that it suits me. And then the other researcher looks at the meal and say, I'm going to be authentic. I'm going to honor the culture and make my meal exactly the way it was intended, or the way the cultural people eat it. So which of these two people is right? Is there a right or wrong way of approaching the meal? No, there isn't. So they are both correct, because they laid out utensils, which meant that you could adapt the meal to fit your local situation. So this happened on Monday night or Tuesday night, and we had tacos, and some of us ate tacos with our spoons, and some people made a nice burrito. And the anthropologist in the house was like, only 3 of us made a burrito? So I thought it was a very fitting story to share, because this presentation has a lot of food in it. It wasn't done on purpose. So when that happened, I was like, okay, let's integrate this into the presentation. All right. The title of the presentation is Enhancing Student Interest and Motivation Through Cultural Integration in an Online STEM Community. And we have myself, Dr. Eric Hamilton, and Christina Alonso. So objective, before we get to objective, I was going to do this little thing where you tell me, Mongai, Ashungai, that's how we start storytelling in my tribe. So when you say Mongai, if I say Mongai, you say Ashungai, Lulo, then you say oh, then I'll start telling the story. I didn't get to do that, it's okay, next time. The objective was to investigate how cultural integration influences student interest and motivation in STEM within the ABLE Global Online Community, which is a project at Pepperdine University, and Dr. Danielle Espino is part of that also. The assumption was that integrating culture into STEM education enhances engagement for diverse learners, because this project brings in children from across the globe. And in this particular project, we had children from Ghana. We had children from Ghana, Kenya, USA, and Brazil. And we had 15 transcripts from 15 breakout rooms. So we had 15 breakout rooms that we put the transcript together and we transcribed that. It's only 2023, and this phase is all about engagement. So it wasn't a lot of data, but it was enough for me to be able to start looking at how they are, what they're interested in. And the theories that I used was the Hailey and Renigar's 4-phase model of interest development, and I'm looking at phase 1, the trigger situational interest, which looks at the short-term interest sparked by external factors, and these factors are culture in this case. I also use the interest-driven theory, or we also use the interest-driven theory, learning through interest and creation, and interest creation habit loops. And I use the cultural integration framework and the transfer and adoption of universal principles, which cultural integration framework only encourages us to integrate culture into STEM and other curriculums. And the transfer and adoption allows us to adapt, like the food we adapted, adapt it to the culture of the child, or adapt the content to the culture of the child, so that the child can better understand it based on their local context. The code book was broken into 4, and we looked at interest and motivation, what students enjoy or value in STEM, and then we looked at the culture combined, which are the beliefs, values, heritage, and practices. And within this, you have different factors. For example, heritage included food, included music, clothing, all those low-hanging fruits of culture. The beliefs are more the deep stuff, and the values are more the deeper stuff. The local STEM was about customizing what they were learning in STEM to their local environment, trying to see if, as they are seeking interest, are they seeking interest in saying things like, I am going to create a water project to solve this problem in my local community. So they're using STEM not just as a theory, but they're using it to solve local issues or customizing ideas in STEM in a way that is relevant or culturally relevant to their local environment or to their learning. And additionally, we had things like cultural sensitivity, how they were displaying cultural sensitivity towards each other, a sense of belonging, how all these things were forming a sense of belonging. Identity recognition is just basically where they're accepting each other as they are, where they're respecting each other, and where they using, for example, one thing that is so small but so big is how you deal with authority. When there was an authority in the room facilitating, would they say, Dr. this, Mr. this, or would they just call the person by their name, which is fine in a global environment if the global majority is not using those labels, but in an African context, the child is supposed to show respect for their elders. So are they doing those things, or are they adapting the culture of the room as it is? All right, so there were a really good level of connections that happened. We have strong connections between culture combined. So we do culture, the theme culture, we had beliefs, practices, and all of that. We put them all together and combine them as one. And when you look at culture combined, we had it combined with interest, and then all of that supported local STEM. All of them showed the same as you would see. The connections were similar, except for Ghana. And then there's a slight difference in cultural elements across all countries. If you look at the top, you see that some had more connections and others didn't. And then you look at the US, learner shows a comprehensive connection within all the codes that we had, which I found to be very interesting, that they made more connections with all the codes that we had for the constructs. Now let's dig deep a little bit and see our subtractive graph of the two. So US Ghana group are very invested in learning about peers' unique cultures and STEM in general. They're in a STEM space, so it would make sense that they would want to learn about STEM. But they're also invested in that early stage to know about the culture of the other students in the room. One of them, when you look at culture combined and interest, motivation, one of them mentioned that I've never left the States or the continent, and another said, I feel like there's a lot of Asian dishes that I think are really fascinating, as well as African dishes. There's definitely some things that you want to try, but you just can't get over here in the US, or at least not like the proper dishes. So just the awareness of knowing that there is a difference between a taco, maybe in Mexico, and a taco here. So it kind of connected to some codes very loosely, which was really nice to see. And then linked to the US learners and local STEM and culture, we use the code. I chose to talk about how AI could be a threat to society. These days, with things like Tesla and all the new phones, you wonder if people might get into technology that they forget about the natural world and stop understanding the natural habitat. that concern, that love, the values that they are bringing into, we coded those as part of culture, like this, the deep level culture, we call that deep values are part of the deep level culture. How is this forming them in general as they look at technology, as they work in this technological space? Links between Ghana culture combined and cultural sensitivity and also interest motivation. I think there is a reason behind why I chose this. And I hope by the end of our discussion, I'll be able to know each and every kind of food they like and maybe how I will just prepare it. So this one wanted to learn about the different foods and go prepare it at home. But without technology, this child will probably never be exposed to as many different varieties of food as they have been exposed to through the project. So for me, that was exciting because it wasn't just about learning tools and how AI works or how that other thing works. It was applying these things to learn about each other and grow even their cultural capacity to a certain degree, even though that was not what we were measuring this time. Just so you can be hungry. All right, so in conclusion, integrating culture into STEM triggered students' interest and motivation and also engagement in this diverse community or across the diverse cultural backgrounds that we had in the room. Cultural integration fosters inclusivity, understanding, and meaningful cultural exchanges, which is what we observe with them talking to each other. Cultural integration enriches learning for students from diverse cultural perspective. Like, I didn't point out a lot of that, but it was that sense of belonging that really showed up also because they felt comfortable in the room. It wasn't just talking about STEM, walking into the room, maybe feeling intimidated for your first time with all these other kids, especially for the African kids that are not constantly exposed. So sometimes they might see some self-esteem issues, but having stuff like that, like food, things that they can connect over quite easily allows them to like just feel at ease and allow the other students to engage with them on a topic that is common to everybody. And the last one is triggered educational. So tailoring educational strategies to cultural diversity promotes a more effective STEM learning experience as demonstrated by our unique engagement patterns among all learners. So it is our hope that we would keep reminding ourselves that STEM is not acultural. STEM, we can apply culture into STEM. We can allow culture to influence the way our children learn in STEM. And even as it has shown, it helps improve their engagement, especially in the early phase that we are in. Our hope for the future is to assess the interest development over the number of years. Hopefully, I'm hoping that the children that are in the ABLE project, a few of them will stay throughout the duration of the program, and then we could see if how this affects them and if they continue to apply culture in different aspects of their STEM learning. And then that will allow us to do the phase 2 to 4 of the Heidi 4-phase developmental interest development. All right, and this was funded by NFS. And I want to thank the ABLE team for letting me use the data. Thank you.
Thank you.
Food again.
It looks good. We have time for a few questions if anybody has any questions for Ruth.
Yeah.
So, and it's kind of a bunch of questions in one. So, it sounds like this happened pretty early on in the program, so I just wanted to confirm that I understood that correctly. And then I'm curious, what were the prompts that were given to these students as they went into these breakout rooms to engage in these discussions? How long did the discussions, were they talking with each other? And then when you talk about cultural integration, was that more of a natural process through the prompts that were, leading them to talk about those cultural aspects, or were there other intentional acts that the team took to make sure that culture was getting embedded in the STEM lessons?
Right. So maybe Daniel can add to that if has any chance. But the thing is, from my understanding, the goal was just to help them start conversation. It was more like icebreakers to allow them to talk. But there was a design that said culture room, right? And some of them had a food room. But the thing is, there were some students that were like biology major that were in the food room, people that cared about other things that were still in the food room. So there was some intentionality to it, but at the same time, it was also something that just flowed as icebreakers as they were going. How is that?
I will not dispute anything.
Thank you.
Other questions?
Thank you very much for a wonderful presentation. So I was very inspired by what you said about the relation between culture and STEM, right? And how you can say STEM is not a cultural or just it's not like a platonic thing that flies above us. So I'm thinking about in a regular like mathematics classroom in Denmark, next door to my house. We tend to teach mathematics or STEM in a way where it is actually very acultural, or we like naturalize our own cultural perspective, right? Have you made any? Have you thought about how to work on this aspect? I mean, so of course, meeting other people from other cultures is a way, but how do we do it what's your thoughts about a regular classroom?
Let's take an African classroom, for example.
Yes, okay. Yes.
Right? For an African classroom, when I was doing my research, the one thing that came up was the mathematics of it. Or one of the reasons I started this work was the mathematics of it. I was talking to a mathematician, like an education math educator, and they had mentioned to me that in the tribe, Kisi tribe, that when they would go to teach math, the students were always struggling because they would count in base 5 instead of base 10. So I was like, okay, why are they counting in base 5, base 10? So I started asking myself, are there other things in mathematics that allow the child in Kisi not to be successful in math because they are thinking about it based on the way they count in their local context? So because of that, I jumped into this work and I started doing this. And I found maybe some differences, something as small as saying 2 divided by 2 equals to 1, right? And a Kisi child was, as soon as you say 2 divided by 2, they're going to say it's equals to 0. Because why are they thinking like that? Like, it's just simple. You have 2 things, you divide it by 2 people, it's 0. They would swear by it, and they're not wrong. When you have 2 things, you give it to 2 people, there's nothing left. So those are just tiny little things to be aware of, but at the same time, a little research is needed, which is why it's like when I say cultural integration, in that cultural integration and augmentation model, there is a framework, there is another I, which allows you to investigate a little bit about the child's culture. That way you see if there are little things in there. And even if you don't have the time to investigate, it's important to be aware that there are those little divergences. And once you're aware of them, you might see something, instead of just saying, you're wrong, you might want to dig deeper. Why is this child thinking the way they are thinking? Is it something that is in their background? Is it some way that they do something at home that is impacting how they are thinking in the classroom? And I'm taking it to be wrong, but it's not wrong based on their local context. Does that help?
Yeah. Awesome. So thanks again. Really appreciate it. We have our next presenter get set up.